Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the greatest show on earth about Canada. Kind of. I don't know. Who's to say? But,
How many other shows about Canada are there?
couple. I don't know. We actually recently ended up on a new best of list. I forgot to
Hmm.
tell you. Yeah, but we
I
actually
saw.
ended up on a new best of for like best for students or something like that, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean,
my
we
name
are
is
featured
Patrick.
in universities.
That is true. My one of my colleagues at the university used us and our interview with George Eliot Clark, so that's fun. Can I introduce you?
Go ahead.
With me is our official Canadian expat to Australia, Mackenzie.
Yo,
If you listen long enough to the show, you'll see his accent slowly change from North American to Australian, and it'll be kind of fun.
sure. Let's go with that.
So the before we get started, of course, on our topic, we like to thank our patrons who support the show: Alex, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, Noah, Paula. All of you make this show possible, and it's great. If you want to support the show, you can donate as little as $1 a month through Patreon or $3 a month and get extra bonus content, um, such as Pop Canada, which a new episode should come out next week if everything goes well.
Sure. Let's
Um,
see.
we'll see. If not, it's totally fine. We'll think of something. Um,
Mhm.
Today, this is the first episode we're actually recording with Mac over in Australia. So there might be a little bit of a delay. We might be figuring some things out in terms of audio and stuff like that. So give us a break. If something's off or whatever, tell us. It's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, today we're talking about Émile Nelligan, a French Canadian poet, and in the notes, someone who I qualified as a tortured Quebecois poet. And I was shocked when Mac told me that he had no idea who this guy was, which just baffled me. Personally, I've heard about this guy because he was taught in CEGEP classes and in high school classes, and even a little bit in university. We talked about him. So, yeah, I'm genuinely shocked as someone who did take many CanLit classes that his name hasn't even come up once. Yeah,
I don't
anyway,
know. I just wasn't my high school.
it's fine. Your high school sucks. But
Probably. Oh,
no, so basically, we're going to be talking a little bit about what was ultimately a relatively short-lived cultural life for Nelligan because of issues that we're going to bring up. And I think most of this episode is going to actually cover his evolution as a poet and how his legacy has been really interpreted. So that's really, I think, going to be most of what this episode's going to look. And we're going to kind of do some readings of translations of his poems throughout. You'll be able to find all of these for free online. They are in the public domain in French. The English translations are a bit harder to find, but we'll link them in the description. And you can get them through the public library that is archive.org. So you should be
mhm.
able to follow along with everything that we do. Okay, so getting into the topic a bit of his early life again, because Mac, you don't know much about him. We'll just kind of talk at you, and then we'll get into one of his first. So, Nelligan was born in Montreal, the son of a postal inspector named David Nelligan and Emily Amanda Hudon. So, one of the major elements of this couple was that it was a quote unquote bicultural couple in this case. So, David was, I believe, Irish, and Emilie Amanda was Quebecois, right? So,
Mhm.
in the eyes of the 19th century, that was as culturally mixed as you can get in this case, Irish and Quebecois. And very early, he would acquire his education at the École Ollier, which is based in Montreal, where he would stay for a few years, and then move on to Saint Louis from 1890 to 1890. However, very early, he would be someone who wasn't a very good student, right? Because he wasn't smart, but because he just didn't give a shit. That's kind of the vibe that he would give out throughout his scholarly education from what I saw is just he wouldn't come to class. that set him back in his studies, which forced him certain parts of his schooling, and which made it so he just wasn't interested
Mhm.
over and over. Which, as a teacher, Mac, I'm sure you've right, not exactly a shocking revelation. Um, his secondary education would be pretty much the same, right? Um, when he went to the Collège de Montréal from 1893 to 1895, repeated twice his course in elementary Latin, which apparently is important to do. At least in 1893, it was apparently important to do. Um, and after a 6-month delay, he would register for only 2 months at the Collège de Sainte Marie from March to for 2 semesters, not for 2 months, for 2 semesters from March 1896 to February of 1897. All of this combined made it so that by age 17, he was already a full 2 years behind his regular schoolmates. And because of that, he felt kind of alienated from his peers and he would just abandon his studies, which was to the great um, detriment of his parents. They did not appreciate that at all. Especially in the 19th century when public education or at least a higher education was starting to become more common. I can imagine parents just pulling their hair out, being like, why are you doing this? We put so much effort and you did nothing with it.
Or the parents are
Um,
going, no, you can't go to school. You have to stay on the farm.
but that's the
The
thing.
farm.
That's the thing. That would be right if if his parents weren't basically um but not necessarily, I don't want to say common workers, but his dad was a postal inspector. He was a blue collar worker. Um,
Mhm.
and his mother wouldn't have necessarily had a job in the 19th century. So it wouldn't
Woman
have necessarily,
jobs.
right. Not a regularly, recognized job. She would have been a stay at home mom at this point,
Mhm.
which is in itself a full time job, let's be honest. But yeah, I don't know. I guess good on him for having done Latin. He knows more than most people, I guess. Funny story, actually. The high school I went to stopped teaching Latin the year before I entered. Yeah, I know. The look on your face says everything. I entered high school in what year would it have been? 2008? Would that make sense? Yeah, 2008, 2009. And yeah, they had stopped the year before, which is insane to me. Why would you be teaching Latin in the 21st century? But yeah, basically, as all good people who feel alienated from society and their peers, there's only one avenue for you, and that's to become a poet. That
Mhm.
would be a trailblazer, and someone who was well recognized for, Quebec society and Canadian society at the time, which is exactly what he. So already at age 17 and 18, he would be starting to write verses and really didn't envision anything else for him. Even if he wasn't immediately successful, he would definitely want to pursue that career despite its ups and downs or its lack of stability.
I mean, yeah, no, if that's what you want, that's fine. Just be aware of the consequence.
Exactly. And I feel like part of that is thanks to his family's position, right? His dad had a stable job and he wouldn't have necessarily had to take, like, you made a joke, I know, of the farm in this
Mhm.
case, but that obviously has a huge impact. And you see that time and time again, where you wouldn't have necessarily had to worry about financial issues or stability if you did anything other than agricultural work or, factory labor at the time. So
Mhm.
probably he's going at it from a bit of a better position in this. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Good on him.
I mean, I'm not going to tell people not to pursue the arts if that's what they
I'm
want.
sorry, I
I'm
didn't hear you.
not going to tell people not to pursue the arts if that's what they want.
Exactly. Yeah. So in 1896, so about 1 year into his time at the Collège de Sainte Marie, he would answer a call for poems from a newspaper called Le Samedi, the Saturday. And that's where he published his first poems for a series of issues in this case. And he would use the pseudonym Émile Cova. All right, good on him, I guess.
Mhm.
And yeah, basically from June to September, he would have a series of he would have a series of poems published in Le Samedi. You could probably find them in a few archives at this point if you're really interested, or in his collected poems, except they're not clearly delineated. And already in these particular poems, you see his influences as an artist. So very much the tradition of Edgar Allan Poe, Octave Crémazie, who we've talked about on the show before, Charles Baudelaire, and Verlaine, all of which would have been American or French in their influences, and that very much informed the type of themes and writing and style that he, especially in his early poems, but also late. And in this early poem in 1896 is where we'll do our first poetic reading. In this case, poetic
Do we
stop
have to?
of.
Do we have to read the poetry?
Do you not like it?
I just don't like poetry.
There's some that we liked. The what was it? One
The
episode
short
or two
ones.
ago, yeah, exactly. You like the Jewish one, YY Siegel. Yeah, that one was acceptable to your taste. So the original name of this particular poem was Rêve Fantasque, which in English, the
Fantastic.
English edition that we're going for is Whimsical Dream. That was the translation. Which is a pretty decent translation. And because of our audience in this case, we'll just be going with the English translation. But again, the French word.
Mhm.
Do you want to read it out loud if you have it in front of you?
Hold on. I can only read the first part page.
Oh, did you not borrow the book in this case?
No, but I can still read it. You can take over afterwards.
Okay, perfect.
We can do some back and forth, some repartee,
Let's do it. So start it off and I'll
as
finish
the
it.
French would say. Hold on, let me clear my throat. Whimsical dream. The proud brown oaks traced against the sad sky's hue. Dark outlines that to their own rhythms move. The darkling elms and fine languorous yews cast shadows on the green nests of love. Here stand strange fountains and silk waterfalls, heart-shaped shrubs and silver cupidons, and deep in the dark, between two long aisles, a deer in bon air style of bronze, great-necked and handsome, the swans both black and white, on the moss and in the waters frisk and play, near the golden nymphs to the mild moon's height. In handsome flocks, the wild birds fly. Soft and distinct sounds, weak in far-off space, echo harmoniously through the cool air. The cloudy night with languid dreams come to place its gulf of darkness everywhere.
To a violent sob and echo again wakes the soul of one who is not with me yet. My soul, quick reminded of memory's pain, is drowned in another regret. How sweet to our end to end our souls' afflictions dire, when time weighs down on us like fierce remorse, whether despair or a black thought require. How sweet it is to end life's course. I still recall through one May night I went, blending my mood to the song the hot winds sing, when I heard, beating beyond the embankment, a black Becephалus galloping. With these vague, charming sounds, fantastically, my romantic dream returned to its void, and in the part where sudden fresh airs play, amid the old picturesque deployed, alone the pale oaks trace in the sad skies less somber lines to their rhythms move. The darkling elms and the quivering you cast shadows on the nests of love. I think that worked out pretty well with the
Mm-hmm.
repartee as you're going. So,
Mm-hmm.
what do you make of this poem in this case? Like, are you actually aware of Poe's poetry or Baudelaire's? They would be probably the two most famous to our modern ears.
I would have to take more time to properly read and analyze,
Mhm.
but there's a lot of there's good nature and imagery at play. And that seems to be obviously that he's talking about something else.
Yeah, I don't know what what's the actual thing that he's going for in this case, but I think obviously the actual title gives an indication in this case, both in French and in English, the reference to a dream.
He's probably
But
dreaming about a man, maybe.
yeah, we'll get into that. We didn't really mention it so far, but there has been some debate as to the nature of Nelligan's sexuality in this case. But
Mhm.
I don't know, in this particular poem, unless you see it, I don't particularly see the reference to men in this case, if it were
Not
like
to
a dream.
men, but
Yeah.
there seems to me a very like, where was it?
Mm,
Soft and distinct sounds weak in far off space echo harmoniously near the golden nymphs. Like there's a very romantic vibe to it.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so like if
And
we take into the fact that he would be gay, the person he'd be romantic with would just be a dude. But for here, he keeps it
absolutely.
vague enough that it could be anything or anyone.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of the idea of whimsical, right? Again,
Hmm.
Pontasque here, like I think that's a pretty good translation, whimsical. But the idea of trying to capture the, a bit more, he has references to Cupid and so on, this a bit more lively imagery that he's going for, I think does play out quite nicely throughout the poem in this case, and surprisingly contrasts the other poems and, spoiler alert, the unfortunate end of his life in this case, which would end rather darkly. So it is kind of
Hmm.
nice to see this attempt at something like a bit more of a joyful imagery that's going for, which might be interpreted, as you're saying, within some of that, both literally and figuratively gayness, so to speak,
Hmm.
in the like regular sense and not necessarily in a pejorative sense. Yeah, there was another poem. There was another part that I thought was kind of interesting, and I wanted to pull it up. Uh, yeah, the this is the third one of the parts that I had read, the third to last stanza in this case. I still recall. Through one May night I went, blending my mood to the song the hot winds sing. Then I heard, beating beyond the embankment, a black Bucephalus galloping. I like that image of Bucephalus. Do you know who Bucephalus is, by the way?
Hmm.
It's
Bucephalus? No, I do not.
so Bucephalus was Alexander's horse, Alexander the Great's horse. He had the name of
Okay.
Bucephalus.
Hmm.
And this whole, yeah, this kind of imagery of an untamed stallion kind of thing, where that this kind of strong animal that brings forward this great historical figure, I feel fits very well within the
Hmm.
power of dreams, so to speak, to advance these great historical moments or people, right, into greater parts of their existence or greater elements of history. So I think that's, like, again, his playing with
Hmm.
imagery and he's playing with these particular symbols is both indicative of his training of the poet and his sensibilities and perceptions of what he can do with the medium of poetry in this case. Okay. So basically, with this type of poetry, right, which again would have been very much influenced by other people, he would have very much added a kind of, he basically added kind of adrenaline boost to what would have at the time been a literary milieu that was very much dominated by epics or patriotism, as we've talked about way too much on the show in this case, or romantic imagery, which still does play a part, as you were saying, in this particular poem. But he's still adding a bit of a new kick, which would have made him very popular, or at least worthy of note at the time, not necessarily popular yet. And
Hmm.
as you're saying, very much stressing symbolism in this case and the power of particular images to carry much more meaning than might have been previously ascribed to poems, right? Which, under the Romantics, for people who might not have known, they were much more interested in and these types of vague ideas of what poetry could do, very much abstract in their thought, whereas symbolists tended to be a bit more grounded and specific in what they wanted to advance as
Hmm.
works. You can counteract me in this case, but I feel like that's pretty accurate as far as like romantics are concerned. Yeah.
Yeah. No, no, it
So,
seems to be working for me.
Gary, so the other poem that I wanted to bring up, did you read Evening Rhythms in this case? I don't think we'll read
Oh, but I
Whypo
can do it
Dreams
right
just for the
now.
sake of time, but did you read Evening Rhythms?
I will read it right now. I
Okay.
imagine it's quick. Yeah. Here, I'll
Yeah,
read it
it's a
out
pretty
loud for
short one.
everybody. See how the tulip, dahlia, and the rose among basins, bronzes, statuaries, in great parks where love sports beneath the trees, singing blue ease, pink and monotonous in blue east, the flower beds sing their joyous chords. When the moonlight's dance is a shifting show, and when briskly the gales their sad notes blow, troubling the pure dreams of solitary birds. See how the tulip, dahlia, and the rose, and crystal lilies, enamored to twilight, turn pale and sad to the sun in its flight, that bears away from beasts and things their woes. See now how the dahlia, like love's red wound, awaits the clear morn's kisses cool and rose. See how the lily, tulip, and the rose mourn the memories with which my soul is drowned. Oh, I can't hear you.
Just comparing these two poems, these first two ones that we've talked about, the whimsical dream versus evening rhythm. Personally, what do you start to notice?
This one's more focused.
How
There's
so?
the original one goes through a lot of different imagery and a lot of different like ideas. This one is just the flowers, just it's a one idea explored to the fullest.
Yeah. And I feel like this one is already a little bit more depressing. I get that he's talking about flowers in this case, but just even in the way that you were reading, it seemed a little bit more down, so to speak. It wasn't as lively as the first one. And just the association of dahlias, for example, if I'm not mistaken, dahlias has often been associated with death, if I'm as far as poetry is concerned and literary devices are concerned.
Yeah, it's only a black
and especially the last line, right? Mourn the memories with which my soul is drowned. So you start to see like this very powerful nostalgia, I guess, coming through in his poetry of wanting to go back to these memories of a simpler time, which we'll get to eventually, but that's one of the elements that people have pointed to as well for what would eventually become his life. In this case, of this deep sense of regret or nostalgia for a better, even though really he started living his dreamed of life at the age of 17. So what does he know? Yeah. And you can also see that, by the way, with the second stanza, the brisky gales and their sad notes blow, troubling the pure dreams of solitary. So very much emphasizing natural and these animals that often are in flock, but that despite them being in a very communal setting, oftentimes feel this great sense of loneliness and individuality that kind of alienates them from everyone else. So, yeah, just thought it was kind of interesting to at least mention this poem. Anything you want to add about this one? I don't think we'll read.
It's interesting. It is, and I'm sure if you knew the language of flowers, there would be a lot more going on if we knew the language.
Yeah, but you're not an expert on flowers?
No, unfortunately not. I've always wanted to be though.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I can see why. It's
Just
used
something
so
interesting
often in
about it.
literary. Yeah. Okay. So the Nelligan would actually distinguish himself, and I think the two poems that we've touched upon already are rather exemplary of this. He would distinguish himself from his contemporaries such as Jean Charbonneau or Lucien Régnier, who would produce very philosophical or very moralistic poetry, which again, classic 19th century, gotta insert that morality. And Nelligan, on the other hand, would be much more sensitive in his poetry, much more subtle in his poetry. And he would very much emphasize this musicality that I think is intrinsic to poetry, to good poetry at the very least. You have to have this musicality.
You need rhythm at the very least.
100%. But as we've seen in the show, not a lot of poets in Canada have shown that, at least a good sense at the very
least. That's because most of the poets are propaganda.
Right, exactly. But that's the point, right? Is that Nelligan is not the first, but the first to do it well at the very least. To be like, no, can I just write something beautiful? Like, how about no?
Yeah, but we don't.
And he kind of very much represents this idea that would be represented as well, or the torch would be carried by much more famous poet Oscar Wilde, right? For example, of the art for art's sake, right? My man, Oscar Wilde. Very much this, not necessarily hedonistic lifestyle. I don't think that's fair to ascribe that to Nelligan per se, but to put a great sense of value onto art as itself, which was emerging in the late 19th century and early 20th century as an important aspect of poetry, literature, and culture. And specifically, he would have known that concept through Verlaine, who wrote it in under the guise of music above all, which
Mm.
comes out to the same thing, really. And this is seen in such poems as Winter Form, or in the French version, it would be called Soir d'hiver. Or again, in the nostalgia that he would sometimes demonstrate in Le Jardin de l'Enfance, or in English, Childhood, which, you get this melancholy that's that really shines through the musicality of the actual poet. And yeah, I think the better one of the two is Childhood Flight in this case. Did you want to read this one if you had it in
Which
front
one
of
is
you?
this?
Childhood Flight.
Ah, yes. Let me give it a whirl as a twitter. I will give it a try. Through old gardens, trampling the roses' peace, to the pure threshold of yesterday's house. Like two sad errand ghosts, we came back now. Let us reach the past dim strands that in stress of joy soon die. But all the same, see how they stand majestic in their ghostly dress. Here let us plumb our hearts embossed with care. Under the huge black tree trunks bended low, that churl, regret, is our mysterious hopes. Let us follow in a 20-year-old ship, far off, through private evenings gone and lost, our children's flight back to its ideal slip.
Thoughts on this particular one?
This one's depressing.
Yep. So
This
again,
one's
starting to see a trend.
he's an artist, so he has demons.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Plus, Childhood Flight. In this case, you can't ignore the title, so to
Mm.
speak. So, particularly the one that stands out to me, at least as far as stanzas go, is the second and the last. So, let us reach the past's dim strand that in stress of joy soon die, but all the same see how they stand majestic in their ghostly dress. And then the fourth one, let us follow in a 20-year-old ship, far off through
Mhm.
private evenings gone and lost, our childhood's flight back to its ideal ship slip. But obviously the content in this case, and I'm curious to your thoughts about this, obviously the content points to this kind of melancholy for the simplicity of childhood.
Yeah,
Um, and both in the ways that we both read this part, the actual meter ends on a bit of a down note, right? Stress, how,
mhm.
dress, ship, lost, slip. It's very much always ending on a bit of a downward
Well, especially
intonation
because
in this case.
there's somebody who's with him in this poem. So there's like
Absolutely.
it's very much a sense of loss, a relationship that's been lost.
Yeah. Who do you think that person might be?
Childhood friend, maybe.
Yeah.
A friend that might have been romantically, I don't know.
It's impossible to say. Like reading this one in particular, I do agree with you as far as childhood friend is concerned. It would make sense, I think,
Hmm.
in the context of the poem. And but yeah, just this idea, there's something whenever you think about your childhood friends, right? You have this vision when you're a child that this is a friend that you'll have forever, but it's ultimately probably the most fleeting type of friendships are the ones that you have when you're in elementary school. They probably last for a summer or a semester and then you move on to another best friend. Right. And I can
Hmm.
imagine that being a source of nostalgia for a poet like Nelligan, who, especially at the time when he would have made such friends, it was very tumultuous because he wasn't. I don't know. Maybe that's me
Yeah.
overthinking this, or
No,
yeah.
it could be definitely a thing.
I don't know. Anything else you wanted to add about this particular poem?
It's depressing. Let's move on.
We have one last one, and it's probably the most depressing, but that one's going to come later. We're going to do a bit more autobiography in this case. Um,
Julio.
so in 1897, he would eventually be able to attend the recently founded École littéraire de Montréal, but he didn't last long there, like less than a year, because he would withdraw almost immediately. But the École littéraire would be like a pretty well known literary circle in Montreal at that time. and would produce probably some of the most interesting poetry. And that's where Nelligan would continue his own output for the short time. And it's actually during this time that he would produce under his own name and publish under his own actual name. So again, you can kind of make a parallel with finding his actual voice and being part of a group of poets, of like-minded people that definitely made him feel more at home or more at ease. So I think that's noteworthy. And you can find these particular poems that he would have started to write under his own name in the short-lived publication of the time called Le Monde Illustré, the Illustrated. In 1898, however, so really only 2 or 3 years after he started seriously writing poetry, he would significantly drop in his poetic output. So as far as people are concerned at that time, he's very much like an eclipsing star in this case, very much a flash in the pan. He did plan on going to England at this time, and that might be one of the reasons why his output fell off. But also because his father was just not happy that he was a poet. Again, showing the major influences of that time, right? Of patriarchal domination. So his son actually found him a place within what was called the Marine Marchande, or the Merchant Marine. And this would have probably reinforced certain negative stereotypes for Nelligan of having to be a part of, more manly worlds than perhaps poetry was considered to be in this case, right?
Manliness.
Exactly. So
little did he know, if he was with, what did his father sign up with, the Merchant Marines?
yeah, exactly. Which is basically,
So he'd be with a bunch of seamen.
exactly. I'm glad that your 16-hour time difference has not changed your sexual wit in this case.
My repartee.
So that we know that the Merchant Marine never actually took place because by October of 1898, Nelligan was still publishing poetry, or he had started publishing poetry again in publications like La Patrie. There were attempts in the late 19th century of actually collecting his poems under the tentative title at the time, Récital des Anges, which would roughly translate to angelic recital, which is a bit pretentious, I think, but hey, it's poetry, so what? And ultimately, that would never shine through, right? It's never been published. It was always a rough draft, and that never went. At the end of 1898, so a few months after he had initially left, he would be readmitted into the École littéraire de Montréal, which, as I mentioned before, would be a part of an importantly growing intellectual movement in Montreal and in Quebec more generally. It brought together poets of diverse backgrounds and leanings, and specifically, which I think is interesting for the time, it was a group that refused to address political or religious matters. And they were really focused on the autonomy of literature, which I think is really interesting as a movement. It's something that you'd see in criticism really only emerge maybe 30 or 40 years later, as far as literary criticism is concerned, right? The autonomy of the work of art or the work of literature. But that in poetry in North America and in Europe, you'd see kind of emerge already at the end of the 19th century. So I think that's kind of cool. And during this time, Nelligan would participate in the group's public readings, and he would very much receive public adoration for the recital of his poem La Romance du Vin, literally the Romance of Wine, which is basically a huge, again, Oscar Wilde-like admiration and impassioned reply to people who think that poetry is useless. Basically, the whole poem is like, no, poetry has value and it's great. And
Oscar Wilde reaction. That brings a new light to things.
I use Oscar Wilde because he's a famous figure and people would know what he's talking about. But yeah, also the gate.
Ha.
You Thankfully, your mic got you out for this.
I'll know you'll get ha. Gay.
There you go. But actually, funny enough, in 1899, after this really impassioned public recital of something that admired poetry as an art form in and of itself that stands on its own, would actually be his last. He would shortly after have to be confined to an asylum, right, in Saint Benoit, which is not far from Montreal. And he would apparently exhibit at that moment signs of what was called at the time derangement or some kind of neurosis. We'll get into what that perhaps was a bit later, but that's why he was brought into an asylum. He wasn't well met. So
I mean,
overall,
who is
sorry.
TBH? Who is
Right,
mentally
yeah,
well TBH?
I know I'm not, but
Just
probably by the standards, I would have been interned as well.
come on, man, just fucking get over it. Go for a walk, get some nature,
But that's what
touch
romantic
some
poetry is.
grass.
So ultimately, by the time he was interned at the end of the 19th century, Nelligan had only published about 23 poems, which is, as far as poetic output is concerned, not a lot. It's barely a collection. But by the end of the 20th century, by the start of the 20th, in 1903, thanks to his friend Louis Dantin and with his mother's help, there were over 107 poems that he had written privately and never published that were eventually collected in what was called Émile Nelligan et son in this. And the book really revealed to the reading public, in this case, his melancholy lyricism and the nostalgia that we've been going through, right? It put it on full display, which wouldn't have necessarily appeared in what was deemed publishable at the time. And it's also the first time that his most famous poem, Le Vaisseau d'Or, which we'll read as well here, which is called Ship of Gold. And this is the first time that it would be published and has been retroactively analyzed as a kind of premonition of his so-called madness. And yeah, do you want to read this particular poem? It's the last one that we'll read out loud, and then we'll talk a little.
Give me a sec. Ooh, stretching, warming up the vocal cord. Okay. Ship of gold. Hewn out of solid gold, a tall ship sailed. Its masts reached up to heaven on unknown sea.
You want to speak a little bit louder? Sorry.
Oh, fine. I was in the zone. Ship of gold. Hewn out of solid gold, a tall ship sailed. Its masts reached up to heaven on unknown seas. Venus, naked, her hair cast a breeze, and scorching sun stood out at the prow unveiled. But then one night on ocean's cheating wave, while sirens sang, it struck as a reef head-on, and dreadful shipwreck beat its hull right down to the depths of the gulf, that rigid grave. A gold ship whose translucence in each part disclosed the treasures that those impious tars, disgust and hate and madness fought to keep. How much remains after the storm's brief wars, and what of that deserted craft, my heart? In dream's abyss, alas, it foundered deep.
Out of all the poems that we've read today, or the 3 or 4, is this your favorite? Do you agree with people that this is his best?
This is pretty good. Not gonna lie. Yeah. Okay. I don't know enough of his poetry to say the best or not, but
seems fine to me. I gave a glimpse of it in this case. Yeah, this is the one that I was introduced to personally when I first was introduced to his work. It's definitely Ship of Gold, and it's actually been covered by Quebecois singers since then, right? On records and music and other poems, other pieces of literature. So it's definitely entered the popular zeitgeist as far as poetry is. And yes, people point to certain lines like the third stanza here, a ship of gold whose in each part disclose the treasures that those impious tars, disgust and hate and madness fought to. They would point to certain lines like this to allude to his madness, but I think the poem in general is indicative of that for its kind of haunting nature, right? This kind of again, its musicality is very much is very much this mourning for something that was lost, like this great ship in this case that had to smash against, or not had to, that smashed against jagged rocks in this case, that was pulled towards it actually by sirens in this case. So it's something that is almost out of the captain's control, so to
Mhm.
speak. And I feel like that's indicative of a lot of the way that we talk about madness, just in popular culture, of not being necessarily the person's fault.
Mhm.
Um, so I feel like that's an interesting way to look at it. Perhaps we're retroactively applying a lot of these ideas. I don't know when Ship of Gold would have actually been written. But yeah, I just find it, I do think there is some validity to its association with his mental states.
Mhm.
Uh, or perhaps it's just a pretty poem and that's okay.
It's a very pretty poem.
Yeah. Anything you want to say about it, either in terms of his madness or potential madness or particular passages that you
From this one, it's interesting the journey from start to finish, how his poems incorporated movement more and more as they went.
Yeah,
And you
interesting.
can see
What do you
his
want to see
songs,
more
his
about?
well, just the earlier ones were very much like, oh, here's the environment, like the very first one we saw, but we're not going to move through that environment. And then we have the flowers, and they're moving a bit in their like own transfer. But in the next one, we moved through the garden, and now this one, the ship is going off on an unknown journey.
Yeah. Where that journey leads, who's to say?
And death.
But yeah, I feel like it doesn't really matter where the ship is going in this case. It would kind of defeat the purpose. Well, at least we know where it's going insofar as like it's going towards rocks. Like,
Mhm.
the actual destination that it was intended on going, I don't think is relevant, or perhaps it points to the fact that he was heading towards something greater or some potential greatness that was, that was, how can I say, destroyed by these natural
Mhm.
forces that were rock, this immovable force that was rock. Yeah, I feel it's kind of interesting for that sense.
Mhm.
So winding down here on his life, during 40 years he would actually stay confined, or over 40 years. Really, the complete end of his life would be spent in that asylum, um, or at least an asylum or a public ward of some kind. But he would still continue to write, right? Um, Although he had completely lost the capability to actually make a cohesive body of work, right? They were little sections of ideas or poems that didn't necessarily connect to any wider project necessarily. And he would often actually rewrite his own poems or other people's poems in order to either make them better or just continue working through certain ideas that he had had over the last decade. In the words of Dr. Ernest Choquette, who had visited him not long after he would be interned, about 10 years into his wardship, I guess you would call it,
Mhm.
he would say that he showed an undeviated obsession with literature in this case. So that's really all that seems to be interesting him. In
Okay.
1925, his father would die in this case. And it's at that point that he would be transferred to a public ward. And
Mhm.
basically all that has emerged from this period, the last years of his life, were notebooks containing these revised versions, faulty titles, and basically reworkings of poems by Baudelaire, Rodenbach, Crémazie.
Mhm.
Didn't really do any. And as one critic noted in this case, it's actually possible that he would have written just texts in the delirium of madness, so to speak, and they were just destroyed.
Good.
Which, unfortunate.
They
I
were
would have
probably
really liked to
rubbish.
see. I would have kind of liked to see what these poems would have looked like, just like this glimpse into this man's broken psyche, so to speak.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm sure it would have been interesting to see, or complete nonsense. Who's to say? Um, part of um, part of the let me start that again. His sister would regularly visit him and provide him with material to write, and the the interest in Nelligan would actually start to increase later in his interning. He would receive more and more visitors during the 1930s, and this is seen as an indication of the growing public interest in his work. By then, at least a few collections would have been published, or at least some form of his poems would have reached wider circulation, and people would have recognized his difference as far as poetry was. And ultimately, just before his death in 1941, about 7 months before his death, he would work on one last poem, which is known as La Bénédiction, and that's dated on April 5th of that year. And that's all she wrote. So I want to talk, or at least I want to end this particular episode on his legacy. So, yes, in the 30s and 40s, by the time he was close to death, he was seeing some renewed interest. But by and large, like his major time to shine was during his life, decades later, and then there has been a bit of a revival since the 70s, right, as he's entered into the canon, so to speak. And even then it's very limited as far as, he gets mentioned in cursory or survey classes of French literature, but he's not really examined in much profundity. So his actual legacy is kind of, as a literary figure, is very much limited, but he has been getting a little bit more attention where sexuality, because people have been showing some renewed interest in him as being an early representation of a queer writer in Canada. And I kind of want to talk about that and see what you think of the arguments in favor of his queerness. So there are two particular trains of thought. One that emphasizes more the literary aspects of his work, which personally I find more convincing. And another one is more of a psychoanalytic perspective on his work. So I want to start this discussion by talking about his madness, so to speak, because there
Madness.
have been,
This
right,
isn't madness.
there,
This is Sparta.
God damn it, because there have been a few ways that people have interpreted his madness, so to speak. As one critic said, it's a mistake, or it would be a mistake, to actually call his illness a so-called neurosis, as certain biographers have mentioned. And instead, it should be perhaps more accurate to call it a psychosis, right? Which often stems from repressed and subsequent analyses of his symptoms and the way that he acted tend to give credence to this. So part of the fact that it was a psychosis, so the idea of repression, has given fuel to the idea that something such as his homosexuality would have been repressed in the very Victorian era of the 19th. But this is a mostly contemporary reading of Nelligan, especially because at first a lot of writers would have, or critics would have, interpreted this kind of repression as, or his dementia, as being a result of his mixed heritage, which is absurd. I don't, I'm sure you can talk about this, but it's that's real madness to me to say that, well, because you have an English mother and a French father, you have to go insane, because there's no way that you can survive in contemporary Canada with.
I don't know. I've got an English father and a French mother,
We both do.
and we're insane. So it's three
Makes
for
no
three.
sense. Like the argument is clearly one that has a very particular political view, right? Of
Racism. It's racism.
that it's just like a very
Just
specific societal like vision
it's
that the two are
racism.
incompatible.
Like
Right.
it's
Like,
certain
I don't know.
societal vision. That's racism.
Yes, yeah, but it's just, it's so funny to me that this ever got any kind of credence. Like, I know it comes from a very specific time in Canadian history and culture, but it's just so weird that that would continue, right? The second and third conventional readings of Nelligan's madness would be his isolation, which I think, is a pretty decent way of looking at it. I think out of all three of the original readings, that's probably the one that holds the most credence, right? Because we know that human beings are social creatures in many ways. And so to have that sentiment of isolation is something that can be very alienating and debilitating for a lot of people. And you see that in the modern world all the time. There's a reason why people are having more and more mental health issues. It's not because, well, part of it is health reasons, yes, but also because of an increasing sense of alienation from the rest of society. So I can see that being the case. And the third one is also ridiculous, and it comes back to something that you see time and time again in society, is that, well, the types of books he was reading would have been very alienating to him and very much inducing a kind of madness or a kind of psychosis, which, shut up. It's the video game argument for the 19th century. It's just not a thing. One of the writers that I read that does stake a claim to the fact that Nelligan can be read as a queer writer claims that all three are ridiculous. Personally, I see the isolation one just by the biography that we went over together. And also the fact that, if anything, right, the homosexuality argument is that being a repressed aspect of his life would have led to some form of isolation. So I think that kind of fits in together. But yeah, this particular writer, who I'll actually quote him, Robert Dole, by the way, and he'll be linked in the description, makes the psychoanalytic case that a lot of writers make the claim that, well, just we're just assuming that Nelligan would have been heterosexual in this case. It is assumed until proven otherwise. And the fact that Nelligan never spoke of his personal life or anything like that, to Dole at the very least, gives some ammo to the fact that he might have been a queer in this case, or he might have been part of that community. And I can see that. It can really go both ways, right? The idea that just because someone doesn't talk about it, it doesn't mean one way or another. But I do like the argument of so-called queering certain writers who you don't know, right? And it kind of leaves it open in this sense. And his psychoanalytic take on it, which I'm not going to get into because that's not the nature of the show, I do feel like that's an interesting one, right? The idea of repression, which is something that Freud and other contemporaries of Freud would have brought up as an aspect of psychosis, right? Repressing certain sexual urges or ideas, I think is one that still holds true in some sense today. So yeah, the obvious absence of a heterosexual relationship. Dole also points to the very feminine atmosphere in which Nelligan was raised. Personally, I think that's the weakest part of his argument, because a lot of people are raised in, feminine households and don't necessarily end up homosexual. Not that it's not true, but I feel like that's perhaps the weakest part of his argument. And yeah, the third part is the Freudian analysis part, right? The psychoanalytic part. Right. The idea that any kind of homosexual action would have been absolutely taboo, right? And in fact, the very word homosexual, as he points out, would not have been coined until 1892. It wasn't even in the popular vocabulary until much later. And yeah, it would have been Nelligan would have been 13 by the time that word was even coined. So on a linguistic level, according to Dole, this type of thing would have been, which again, not a bad argument in my mind. I don't know. Is there anything that you want to add so far to that particular argument, or anything that you want to say about whether or not it has some validity? It's a very short argument, so really most of the arguments I
the
just
argument that he's insane, or
no, that he would have been a homosexual, and that particular
oh,
thing might have led to some kind of repressed.
yes, yeah, no. Well, you look at his
Yes,
poetry, and it seems like the indicators are all there. And you look at his poetry, and the indicators are all there, and I can't say, oh yeah, no, he was definitely gay, but
that's fair.
there's a trend of the time.
Okay. Well, going off of that idea of the poetry, there's a really good blog post that I found That
And I
doesn't
wouldn't be
surprise me.
surprised if they called him insane because he was gay.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Like
Like
I was wondering if that would come up. I was like, yeah,
like
I
gay as a symptom of insanity.
that's the thing, is like that never comes up in any of the biographical elements of
Mm,
the moment, right? Or even in the records, the official records of the hospitals or anything like that, which might have come up because obviously we know that that has come up, or there are certain terms that were for people who were treated differently because of home. So
mhm,
none of that ever arises, which is why Nelligan is still a bit of a debated figure in this. The literary reading of his homosexuality, I think personally, despite my sympathies towards more Freudian readings or psychoanalytic readings, I do think there is still some validity to them in the 21st century. There's a really good literary reading that I linked to in the notes. That's this whole blog that's dedicated to LGBTQ history in Canada, right? And they talk about Nibiga in one of their blog posts. Um, in a blog post that I love, it's called Gaydar Moments, the title, which I love as the title. It's great. Um, but what this writer, who only goes by the name of Hamish, I believe, yeah, Hamish in the actual blog post, what they point to is that in a lot of Nelligan's poetry, like you're saying, you would have these references, not just in the form and the content, um, but would have had certain codings that have since been recognized as ones that are used as underlying images and symbols by queer writer. And specifically, this blog writer points to the idea of the jungle as being a particularly common symbol for Montreal-based poets like Nelligan would have been.
mhm.
And I just want to read a part here that I think is worthy of, in this case, let me just pull it up. So here we, Émile Nelligan's neighborhood is remarkably well preserved. The old gray stone attached houses with their carved porches may be beautiful to those of us raised on, but to Nelligan, they were part of an urban jungle that the speakers of his poems always seemed to want to escape. And north, east, and south, it's old gray stones as far as the eye can see. And he goes on to, they're the maple trees and birches that line the streets give way to the trees that fill Nelligan's poems, which we've read: yews, cypresses, white poplars. You'll also see other objects, like statues, and that seem to fill what could be called his park at night poetry. Reading Nelligan's work and walking the park, it feels impossible to conclude that you're looking at the places in the park poems, and very likely that Nelligan spent at least part of those long nights wandering the forest that was practically his own backyard. That by the time you get to the trees on the eastern slope, you've already entered a place long known to Montrealers in the know as quote unquote the jungle. No one knows how old the jungle is. The men who cruise there tend not to write memoirs about it. It looms large in gay fiction in Quebec, and as early as 1954, there was an official study of it. Historian Luther A. Allen tells us that, quote, it is plausible, in fact, that well before the 1930s, gay cruising had established itself on these trails. And basically, the writer goes on to say that really by the 1890s, clearly at a time when Nelligan would have been writing, this would have been a well-known spot, right, for gay cruising. And they basically go on, like you did, to examine certain aspects, including in the poem Rhythms of the Night, which we read, that would have pointed to more of the queer elements of Montreal or queer spaces of Montreal that would have been known already in the 19th century. So personally, I think that's a very good poetic analysis in this case of some of the queer elements that personally, as someone who's not a part of that community, I'm not
Mhm,
necessarily as attuned to, but I think that this is, well, at least this was a convincing,
mhm.
and I'm glad that you picked up on them as we were reading in this case. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have anything to add so far? I feel like I was reading more at you in this case. Obviously, you read the poems, and I feel like I was
Well, no, and
presenting more.
it makes sense because I am watching my volume and I'm still, but there's a lot to
Are you
go about.
Are you more interested in Nelligan now that I've presented?
Yes.
Are you going to read more of his poems or no? Okay, fair enough. But yeah, is there anything that you want to cap off on or anything that you wanted to mention? I feel like, yeah, this was a bit more of a straightforward episode in this case to get us back into the
Mhm.
episodes. But is there anything that you wanted to mention before we capped off today?
No, feels good to me.
All right. Well, do you want to take us away in that case?
No, you do it.
Okay, I will do it indeed. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We're sorry if the audio shifts have bothered you or not. It's fine. We'll get over it eventually. But thank you, everyone. You can reach out with any questions, comments, concerns on the Facebook page or by email. There is no Twitter anymore. I deleted that account because it's Twitter. It's a weird.
Fuck Elon Musk.
And you can support the show through Patreon, as we mentioned before, through PayPal. If you want to pay what the feel the show is worth, just send a donation. People have sent that before. You can find perks like ad-free episodes or extra episodes on the Patreon. And all of this is optional, really. No pressure. The show will remain free, independent, or at least the show will. And if you really want to help boost the show and get it to more people's ears, the best way to do that is to tell friends. Share it on iTunes, review it on iTunes or on Spotify, share it to some friends. All of that is great. It really does get more listeners, and it allows us to, know what you liked the more you share episodes. But that being said, we'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.
We're an Instacart family.
Oh my goodness, we saved so much time with same-day grocery delivery.
So we joined Instacart Plus.
And now we're saving more money.
We get unlimited free delivery on orders over $35,
5% credit back on pickup,
and a family account to shop together.
Did you know members save $460 a year when they order at least once a week?
I do now. See how much you'll save. Visit instacartplus.com for 2 weeks free. Average savings exclude membership fee. Individual savings may vary. Credit back excludes alcohol. Paid membership auto renews. Additional terms apply.